Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Akshita, for being the moderator. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope you're all doing well and having a great day. It's truly a pleasure to see you all here today joining us for this online presentation on Build Your First Databricks CICD Pipeline in Azure. I'm your host, Sipi Krishna. I work at Cedric Consulting as a senior architect, and I'm here because I'm driven by a passion for embracing new technologies and even a greater enthusiasm for imparting the knowledge that I have gained. I started working in Databricks in 2022 for a client engagement, and previously I have worked on Synapse, Workspace, Data Factory, SSIS, to name a few technologies that I've worked on. And I have been in Azure Cloud since 2015. I have brief experience with AWS as well. I am enthusiastic about biking and I'm incorporating yogas in my daily life, like we eat and sleep. Whether you've joined us from across the globe or just a few blocks away, your participation means a lot to me. So thank you for being here, and let's make the most of our time today and create something impactful and meaningful. So before I dive into today's presentations, it'll be best to set some expectations so that you gain the most out of today's presentation. So it'll be best if you have some prior experience with Databricks, Unity Catalog, workflows, DevOps, and Azure Cloud itself. Because today's presentation, the CI/CD pipeline on Databricks, we're going to be doing it on Azure. Let me talk about DevOps briefly. That DevOps is a set of practices and principles that are used to combine development and IT operations, aiming to shorten the development lifecycle and deliver high quality software continuously. And CI/CD as a part of it is continuous integration and continuous deployment, which is a software development approach that automates the processes of code integration, testing, and deployment, enabling frequent and reliable releases. Now, as we all know, that CI/CD is common in software development, but I think it is increasingly becoming necessary to data engineering and data science people. And with the advent of AI and ML, I think if you have a basic introduction about these topics, it's really helpful. Because by automating and building the code, automating the code that you're building, testing, and deploying the code, the deployment teams are able to deliver releases which are more frequent and more reliable rather than having to do it manually every time. So this is our agenda for today. We're gonna talk about the takeaways for today. Then I'll introduce Databricks repos and provide a short demo on the Databricks repos. Then we'll talk about Databricks CI/CD pipelines. And I'll introduce Databricks asset bundles. Asset bundles is what I'll be using for the deployment for Databricks workflows. And then we'll end with a demo on the Databricks CI/CD pipeline with Azure DevOps. These are the takeaways for today. So by the end of the session, you should feel comfortable with building your basic Databricks deployment pipeline, and you should be able to understand how to use repos in Databricks and how to connect to repos in Databricks. You should understand the basics of Databricks asset bundle, and you should be able to move your code as well as your orchestration pipelines, your data pipelines from one Databricks workspace to another Databricks workspace. As a data engineer, I feel empowered when I have this capability and know-how of how I can move my code to production with automation. And DevOps, as we all know, it combines development and operations. And the focus on today's presentation is using Databricks and then how to integrate CI/CD with Databricks. So without further ado, let's dive into the first topic for the day, which is Databricks repos. I believe that when we start working on any software development project, be it an app dev project or a data project, it should start with setting up the source control and laying down the guidelines of how your team will be using the source control. So the first step is that as a team decide on the approach for the source code management, and depending on the team dynamics and the team environment that you're working in and how much time is available and what is the team experience, and there could be some other factors. This is something that you will want to brainstorm with your team, or this is something that could be an organizational guideline that is already provided to you. So I'm suggesting here a first approach is which is the feature-based approach that you can take, where you have three different branches: a development branch, a testing branch, and a production branch. And then you can use each branch to promote your Databricks code to different Databricks workspaces. And then there is a second approach, which is you maintain one single trunk branch, which is a trunk-based approach. And then developers frequently integrate their changes from their feature branches into this main trunk branch. And this facilitates quick and regular releases of the software. So there is no right or wrong here. You can choose either of the two approaches, or you can have a completely new approach. But this is just a suggestion that the start with choosing your code management strategy that you want to use as a team, how you're going to check in, check out, what that process will look like, how many branches you will have, how you will use these branches in your different environments: dev, prod, staging, testing. So start with this thought in mind that, okay, what is my code management strategy that I'm going to use in my project? And that's the first step. The second step is deciding on what Git provider you'll be using for Databricks. Now, there are certain Git providers that Databricks provides connectivity with at the time of when I was creating this presentation, and there could be more, which are because things are evolving and Databricks is evolving new things. So these are the cloud Git providers that Databricks provides connectivity with. So you can connect to Microsoft Azure DevOps, AWS Code Commit, GitLab, Bitbucket, GitHub, or if you have a different requirement, you can reach out to Databricks directly for if that requirement can be fulfilled. Now, these are all the cloud Git providers. If you have a requirement for on-prem Git provider, Databricks also provides connectivity with some of the on-prem Git providers, which you can refer to the document. I have listed it in the references section that you can also look at. So now that we have two things out of the way, one is that what is our code management strategy, and the second is what Git provider we're going to use with Databricks. We have to do certain setup. And the setup that I'm going to be talking about today is entirely based on Azure Cloud. If you're using a different cloud, the setup steps might vary somewhat. So the first step, which is very obvious, is that you need to have a Databricks workspace in Azure and access to the workspace. And the repos in the workspace should be enabled. By default, it is enabled, but an admin has access to disable the repos. And depending on the version of Databricks you're using, it is possible that if it is a very old version, maybe you don't have repos. But in the newer versions, you will have repos enabled. The second, which is also a very obvious one, is having your Git provider access. And if you're using Azure DevOps, in Azure DevOps, you have to create an organization. And then within the organization, you have to create a project. So you have to create these two things and have access to these things. And third is having access to Azure DevOps. And then you have to create a repo in Azure DevOps. So in Azure DevOps, you have to have the right access to there is a basic access, stakeholder access in Azure DevOps. Basic access provide access to the repos. If you there is a cost associated with the basic access. There are 5 or 6 basic accesses that are free in Azure DevOps, and then they're paid and the cost is minimal. But if you have a Visual Studio Professional or Enterprise license, then that can also be clubbed for access to the repos in Azure DevOps. So it's not entirely free if your team size is larger. So you'll need to get that level of access. You'll have to create a repo in Azure DevOps. The next step is authentication. So you want to think about how you will authenticate from your pipelines in Azure DevOps to Databricks. So I'm going to be using personal access token authentication, and I'm going to be referring it as PAT. But Databricks also does allow us to use Microsoft Entra, which was earlier Microsoft Active Directory. If you plan to use Microsoft Entra ID, then you'll have to integrate Databricks Workspace with Microsoft Active Directory, which is a separate process. I'm not going to talk about that here, but if that is what you plan to do, make sure that the Databricks Workspace is integrated with the Microsoft Active Directory or Microsoft Entra ID, which is now it is named as that. And the last step is that Databricks repos needs connectivity to your Git provider. Now, with some clients that I've worked with, Databricks workspace could be behind a virtual private network, or even Azure DevOps organization could be behind a virtual private network. So if that is the case, you might want to reach out to your IT team and the networking folks to make sure that these two resources can talk to each other. There is a peer-to-peer connection between the networks in which they reside behind the scenes. And one more thing that I would like to mention here is that in Databricks, when you log into Databricks and you go to the user settings in Databricks, you want to make sure that you have added your Git provider as a linked account under the user settings. And then you will be able to add that particular Git provider and connect your repo. And I'll show you that in the demo, how to do that. So these are all the setup steps. And now we are ready to start integrating repos in Databricks. So I'll start with, so let's talk about this a little bit, and then I'll start with the demo. And when these are all the steps that we need to take when we integrate Databricks repos and the Git provider. And there are certain steps that we can do in Databricks, and then there are certain steps that you have to do in the Git provider. So let me talk through each of these steps, and we'll connect to Databricks, and I'll show you this login again here. So the first step is setting up the top level folders. And I hope that this is big enough to see. So this is the Databricks workspace. And in the workspace, when you click on repos, in the create option, there is a folder option here in the create folder options. I'm going to click on folder, and then you can create a new folder. Say I create a development folder over here. So this folder is created over here. You can see here. This is the first step that they're talking about here is set up your top level folders. So that's how we can set up the top level folders. And then in order to integrate the repos, now when you log into Databricks, you will not see a user folder. Since I have already integrated the repo first time, I see my user folder. My repo is already integrated here. But if you're logging in for the first time, when you click on create, you will have an option to attach the repo. Now, what I talked about earlier is that in the user settings, in the linked accounts, you have the option to select your Git provider. So you have to make sure that you select this correct option, whatever you decide to use. For my purposes, I'm using personal access token. So I've selected Azure DevOps Services personal access token. Going back to my workspace, when we click on the username over here and click on the repos, then I have to provide the Git repository URL. And the Git repository URL you can clone from your DevOps. So when you click on the clone and you can copy it and then provide it, it'll auto-populate the Git provider and the repository name, if the repository name already exists. I created the repository name before. There is an option like you can check in from here as well. I'm going to cancel this because I have already integrated my repository over here. So let's talk about, so we talked about how to clone the repository in this step, and then let's see how to create a new branch. So I'll click on this branch name. I want to show you how to create a new branch. It's taking a bit of a time to load. You click on create branch, and suppose I say my branch as SK new stars, so new stars, and create a branch. So what it is doing is from the main branch, it is creating a new branch. And then if I cross this, you can see here now it is pointing to the new branch. What I'll do now is, so this is how we create a new branch. Let's create and edit assets in the Git folder. So in this branch, if I select, say, any file over here, and these are all Databricks learning materials. So if I click on any file here and I add something over here, I can see if I click on the branch again over here, I can see what file I have changed and what I have changed in the file. So this is how we interact with Databricks repos, and then we can actually commit the changes. So I'll add a comment, new commit, and I'm gonna commit and push the changes. So as I commit and push the changes, these changes are now pushed into the branch over here. So you can see a new commit has been created. So this is how we commit and push the changes. So these are all the steps that we do in Databricks. And then if we want to merge the changes, we can also merge the changes in Databricks, but I'm going to show you how to merge the changes in DevOps. So I'm going to create a pull request. You can add reviewers here, and I'm going to just create it. And when I create the pull request, let's talk about Git automation invokes the Git folder API, and that's what is going to happen in the next step. So if I go back to Databricks and in the workspace, I've got a production folder. And in this, in the main branch, I'm connected to the main branch in the production folder. So as I said, you have to first create your folder, and then you have to also attach your repo to the folder. So you can see there are no new commits over here. The pull doesn't have a number to it, meaning that there are no new commits. But I'm going to approve this and complete it. So as soon as I complete it, it's going to merge my changes to the main branch, and it's going to trigger my pipeline. So let me refresh the screen. I can see there are new commits over here, and also in the pipeline, the code deployment pipeline is triggered, and it is going to deploy the code to this Databricks workspace. And so when I refresh this again, the new changes are now into my production folder. That two on the side as beside the pull has gone. So the new changes are now in the production folder. So let me clarify this a little bit. So what I did here is we made an API call. So when we made a change to the code, we made an API call. This API call was made through Azure DevOps, and then Azure DevOps deployed the code to a production folder. And I'll explain it a bit more for going forward in the as we move forward in the presentation. But what I want you guys, the takeaway from here is to understand how to integrate the repos with Databricks. That's the takeaway from here. So let me go back to the presentation. And let me explain like the parts that we did in Databricks and the parts that we did in the Git provider. So you can clone the repository in the Databricks. You can create a new branch in Databricks. You can push and pull changes in Databricks. You can commit your changes, merge, and resolve conflicts as well. In the Git provider, you can create a pull request. You can also create a new branch. So there are certain things that you can do in both Databricks as well as Git provider. You can do peer reviews in Git provider. Now, peer review is also someone can argue is possible in Databricks, but I recommend doing it in the Git provider because it's at the notebook level. It will not be tracked within your Git provider, the ones that you will do in Databricks workspace. You can also do Git automation. Git automation is what I just showed you, is when I committed my changes to the main branch, it got deployed to the production folder. And then we can merge into the main branch that I showed you guys. And it is also possible to resolve conflicts in the Git provider portal itself. So there's certain things that we can do in both Databricks workspace as well as the Git provider. And then there are certain things that as a developer you'll want to do in only in Databricks workspace, so that you're only allowed to do in Databricks workspace. Now, there are some key points and things to remember when working with Databricks workspace, and this I'm sharing based on my experience that I have with my working with my client, is that when we first log in into the Databricks workspace, every developer has to establish a connection to the repository. Now, if you've worked on Synapse Workspace or Azure Data Factory, that is not the case there. Like if once an admin has set up the connection with the Git repository, every developer who logs in sees that connection and does not have to individually connect. But in case of Databricks, everyone has to follow the steps that I have shown in order to connect to the Git repository. And so you can think of it as there is an embedded Git client within the Databricks um, browser experience itself. So you don't have to install that Git client, but rather Databricks has embedded the Git client. So if you worked on an app dev project, each developer has to connect to the Git client separately. They have to download the Git client and then they have to clone the Git repository. And that is exactly what you have to do when you're working in Databricks. Now, this was a browser-based experience. What if you're not working in the browser and you're using Visual Studio Code? Then in that case, you will download a plugin for uh, connection to the Git. Another thing to note over here is that the notebook outputs, when you run the notebook and the output that it generates, they're not included in the commit by default. When you commit your changes, they will not when you the output of the notebooks will not get committed to your repo. And similarly, when you pull the changes from the repo, the notebook outputs will be cleared. So if you want to save your outputs for future reference, you might want to save them explicitly, otherwise they will get cleared. And in the local branches in Databricks cannot be deleted. You will have to delete them from the origin itself. By origin, I mean from the Git repository itself, you'll have to delete them, and then you'll have to clone the repository again. So be careful when working with the repos and trying to delete anything because if you clone the repository again, you lose your changes that you have not staged. So that's all about Databricks repos. Let's dive into the CD side of things, that is the continuous deployment. I have given you a glimpse of continuous deployment already by showing how the code was deployed to the production folder. So let's dive into it further. So Databricks has certain assets. And by assets, I mean the notebooks that we create in Databricks, workflows, which are our orchestration pipelines, the libraries, if you're referring to any of the Python libraries or some other libraries that you're referring to, or clusters. So when we move from one Databricks environment to another Databricks environment, meaning one workspace to another workspace, these are all the assets that we want to move. Or if you're using a storage account, then storage account between different environments can be different. So you want to parameterize these things. So these are the assets that we will bundle for our deployment in the CI/CD pipeline that we'll talk about. So let's understand the development flow. And this is maybe a recap of Databricks repos again, but it's important to understand this because once we understand it, it'll be easier for us to understand how to deploy using Databricks. So Databricks repos have user level folders and they have non-user level folders. So user level folder is like presenter CP or glitch carry. These are like user level folders. And then non-user level folders are the folders that we explicitly create when we clicked on create folder, like the development folder or a production folder is like explicitly created and they're not attached to a user. Now, as a user, if you do not have admin access, you will not be able to see the folders of other users. If you have admin access, then you can see the folders of other users. So basically, you can access the folders of other users. You can see what code they're writing, even if they've not committed to the Git repository. Then if you have admin access, you can see what local development they are doing. And you can actually go into their notebooks and modify the notebooks, but they can, like two people can work together in one single notebook, but you have to have that right level of access to be able to do that, which gets crazy, I know. Um, but just letting you know that that is possible in Databricks. So you can treat your Databricks repos in these user folders as your local checkouts, which are individual to the each user. And for the code deployment automation for this presentation, I'm going to be using the non-user folders. Now, I'll talk about that in a little bit, what the other way is. But for this presentation, I'll be using the non-user folder for the deployment. So let's understand the production flow. So that was the development flow, meaning how the developers will work in Databricks workspace. And this is just one recommendation. There could be multiple ways on how the developers decide to use Databricks workspace and how they decide to collaborate. So in the production workflow, when we create our workflows in Databricks, by workflows, I mean the orchestration pipelines, the data pipelines that we create in Databricks, we create tasks in there. Within the task, the lowest level is that you will call a piece of code, which is essentially in your notebook. So you have to tell the task where exactly that notebook lives. So this is a task, and in the task, you have to provide the source of the notebook, whether it'll be the workspace or whether it'll be a Git provider. If it's the workspace, then these folders is where it'll read it from. It can also read from the user level folders. But you don't want to do that because if you read from user level folder, then that user needs to exist on all your Databricks workspaces in different environments. If you have, say, production, staging, development, then the user will need to exist in all the environments. And that you can do if you're using a service principal. So that service principal uh, folder will live in all the environments. Or you can use a Git provider. So then you don't have to create these user level folders when you specify a Git provider. In that case, it will directly point to the different branches in your Git provider. And if you choose to use the Git provider, then you have to point to the right branch in the right environment. And there is no right or wrong approach. There is no preference here. The preference is what works best for you, what works best for your team, for your project, for your organization. So there is no right or wrong here that if I suggest, no, you should always do workspace or you should always do Git provider. No, there is no right or wrong here. It's what works for you. So if you choose to use the Git provider option, then Git repos will be your single source of truth. And you will have to choose a strategy, like a Git strategy, where you make sure that different Git branches point to different Git workspaces. So I think of it like if I'm working in the development environment and I choose Git provider, then I'll point to my development branch. And if I'm in the testing environment or the staging environment, I point to my testing branch. And for production, point to the production branch so that there is a clear segregation of when I'm deploying to a particular environment, which branch do I need to refer to. So when we promote our workflows from one environment to another, we will parameterize this branch name. We will change the branch name that we are pointing to in different workspaces. And if you choose to go with the workspace option, then in your different workspaces, you will need to create your um, folders. And these folders can be these folders can be accessible in all your environments, or one folder can be there in one environment. That is completely a choice. So in one workspace, suppose development workspace can have access to production and staging folders, or development workspace can only see the development folder. That is completely a choice. One thing I'll point out here is that take care of the permissions of these folders. Like, these are non-user level folders, so admin users should not be able to modify it. The developers should not be doing the development in these folders, and accidentally that can happen. But you have to be careful that don't do development in these folders. And to do that, if the admin sets a permission on these folders so that they cannot be modified by any non-admin user, I think that is the best approach to take there as a precaution. And in order to update these folders, you can use Databricks repos. And I'll talk about Databricks asset bundles next, where you can also use asset bundles to update these folders. In this demo, I'm using the Databricks repos. So you can run the repo API with the curl command, with Postman, or even with Terraform. So as we know, there are different ways to deploy to Databricks, and Terraform is one of them. But you cannot use Azure Databricks user interface for calling the repos API. As of when I created this presentation, this might have changed. So let's talk about Databricks asset bundles. It's currently in public preview. Asset bundles is basically infrastructure as a code approach to managing Databricks projects. And I'll be using asset bundles in this presentation for deploying my Databricks workspace from one Databricks workspace to another Databricks workspace. So these provide a way to share the assets that we talked about, the four assets that we talked about: notebooks, clusters, libraries, and workflows. So these assets can be shared between different teams and different Databricks workspaces by using Databricks asset bundles. And there are many different ways of how you can use Databricks asset bundles. We're going to be talking about just one approach that I'm using. So Databricks asset bundles allow you to package and distribute all your assets within the Databricks. And we're going to be using this for our deployment for this engineering use case. So the bundles use YAML files behind the scenes. They create YAML files, and YAML files are used to specify your artifacts, resources, and configurations of the Databricks project. Bundles can be created manually, or they can be generated from a template. And I'll show you how to generate the bundles. Databricks CLI is what provides the default templates for simple use cases. But if you have some complex use case, you can customize your Databricks asset bundle that is generated by the Databricks CLI as a template. So there are a lot of possibilities here. Databricks asset bundles only work with Databricks runtime 11.2 and above. So if you're using anything lower than that, this approach will not work. So let's see how to set up Databricks asset bundles. The first step there is that you need to install Databricks CLI. Depending on what kind of an OS you're using, whether you're on a Windows machine, a Linux machine, or a Mac OS, on all these machines, you can install Databricks CLI. Behind the scenes, when we're working in Databricks, the clusters in Databricks are running on the Linux servers. So for your DevOps pipelines, I will suggest using a Linux machine, though for a client, I am using a Windows machine too. So that will also work. But there are just different setup steps for Databricks CLI when you're using a Windows machine as compared to when you're using a Linux machine. So the first step is install Databricks CLI, and it's very simple. Like I installed it on my Windows machine, like I'm using a Windows machine currently. So I just installed it on my Windows machine to actually test my Databricks asset bundles. So before we start building a YAML pipeline, what I always do is whatever steps that I follow in my pipeline, I always do that locally and see whether it is working, and then I move it to the pipeline. So the first step is, in order to start using the Databricks asset bundles, is to install the Databricks CLI. So I'm using this command winget install Databricks CLI that installs my Databricks CLI. The second step is authentication. So when we think about authentication, we need to decide what approach we're going to be taking. So in this case, I'm going to be using PAT, which is personal access token authentication. And if you choose to use a different kind of authentication, go through the documentation and follow the steps from there. For PAT authentication, what you need to do is you need to then write this command Databricks configure profile default, which is over here. And then this is what I did over here. It asks, when you click on enter, it asks for the Databricks host name, which is the URL of your Databricks workspace. And then it will ask for the personal access token. Now, this personal access token that you see here is disabled. It will not work. So don't try to use it. All right. So this is what we do is like we enter our host name and the personal access token, and then it will create a Databricks config file behind the scenes. So this is the Databricks config file it creates, and this is the backup file also it creates. So this config file will have our credentials, and this is what will be used by the pipeline or your API call to actually reach to the Databricks workspace. If you're using a Microsoft Entra ID, this file will still be created, but the contents of the file will change, because then you will essentially provide your tenant ID, your client ID, and the information related to your Entra ID, your client secret and everything will go in this file. And Databricks documentation provides in detail the steps if you decide to use the Microsoft Entra ID. Now, a few things to keep in mind here is that if you're using a Linux-based machine, then this file needs to be in the user root folder, which is represented by the tilde sign. If you're using a Windows machine, then you need to provide the user profile folder like this within your YAML pipeline so that it can understand and by default find where your Databricks config file is, from where to read the credentials. And this is essential for Databricks asset bundles. So these are important files, and the YAML pipeline will not work. Your Databricks CICD pipeline will not work if it is not able to find the credentials file. And also you need to have a dot in the beginning of the file. Not sure if it's visible, but there is a dot in the beginning of the file over here. So it's a dot Databricks CFG file that needs to be created. The third step here is to initialize the bundle, and the command to initialize is Databricks bundle init. What initialize does is it generates a template for Databricks asset bundles for us. So when I run initialize, it asks me for my project name, and I have given all the other defaults. And I'm also not using these for my purposes. Like I'm not using Delta Live table pipelines. I'm not using a Python package to create a wheel file or something that if you want to create that. But I've just put yes, everything, and I'm doing all the defaults. So what the defaults will do is it'll create a folder structure for you. Now, something important to note here is the project name. Like I'm using demo over here. So it creates my Databricks asset bundles with the project name of demo. So this is your template, and then we can customize this template. Now, one more point here that I want to add is, and this is again based on experiences, when we start using asset bundles, the bundle template that was created is actually missing an important file, which is the Databricks template schema.json file. So you'll have to manually add this file to your template folder. and I will show you where to exactly add it. But these are the contents of the Databricks template schema.json file, and the contents are available in Databricks documentation. But this is one additional step that needs to be done after initializing the bundle. So the default over here, DBC deployment, that is my project name. Now, I was showing demo earlier, but I switched to DBC deployment. I wanted to show this difference to tell you to make you aware of the fact that whatever project name is in this Databricks template schema.json file, that is what will be used by the asset bundles. Additionally, in the customization section, like adding that template file as a requirement, and then let's talk about the customization a little bit. In the customization section, we add the YAML files, the workflow YAML files. Now, these workflow YAML files, till what I am aware of, needs to be copied manually from your Databricks workspace. So when you log into your Databricks workspace, when you create your first workflow, you will see an option like there'll be these three ellipses. When you click on that, it will show you a view YAML JSON option. And when you click on view YAML JSON, it will open a new pop-up window where it will actually show you the YAML source. Then you need to copy this YAML and you need to put it in the resources folder in your Databricks asset bundle template that was generated. So if you have, say, 20 orchestration pipelines, so 20 times you have to copy the YAML files into your resources folder in the template that was generated, and that is called customization, basically. I wish that there was an API call that I can add to my pipeline so I don't have to have this manual step. But last when I worked on this, the API call was not available. I am in touch with Databricks people to find out like if there is a API call that is available now that I can use. So I don't have to do this manual step. So once we have customized our asset bundle based on our requirements, I've talked about one customization. There could be multiple other customizations that you can do with the asset bundles based on your requirement. Then we need to validate the bundle and deploy the bundle. So that I'm going to show you in the demo itself how to do that. So let's go to the pipelines. And let me start with the code deployment pipeline because that's what I showed you earlier. So in Azure DevOps, and this is a YAML pipeline. And don't be scared of YAML at all if you have not heard about it. I'll explain briefly what these pipelines are about. In the YAML pipeline, in the Azure DevOps, we can create either YAML pipelines or classic pipelines. I'm creating a YAML pipeline over here. Now, YAML pipelines basically are, if you've used like JSON before or XML before, they're lightweight versions. They have removed all the non-essential tags and they are recognized by the machine as well as they're human readable. And the full form of YAML is YAML ain't a markup language. Um, so YAML is basically key value pairs, and it is defined by using this colon sign. It separates the key and value using the colon sign. And it defines a list with the hyphen. We can create nested structures as you're seeing, like this is a nested structure over here. So we can create nested structures in YAML pipelines. So we have got pipeline resources. What are pipeline resources? These are the resources which we will be consuming in our pipeline. So I have to, there are 6 different kinds of resources which are there in YAML pipeline. I'm using one of them, which is repository. The other resources are containers, packages, webhooks, pipelines. There are other resources also, but in this pipeline, I need repository. I'm providing the repository from which I need to get my code, and I'm also telling that giving the pipeline trigger. So pipeline triggers also are different kinds of pipeline triggers. There are CI triggers, continuous integration triggers, PR triggers, which is pull request triggers, there are schedule triggers. There are other kinds of triggers, but these are the three high level triggers. And here I'm using a CI trigger, which is a continuous integration trigger, meaning that as soon as there is a commit on the main branch in this repository, which this repo is the same repo that I have in my Databricks workspace. So as soon there is a commit into the main branch, this pipeline is triggered. I'm also excluding my current branch. So let me show you this. I've got two branches here. One is my DBC learning branch, which is associated with Databricks. And one is the DBC deployment branch where I have my Databricks asset bundle. I'll come to it in a minute, but let me come back over here. So I'm excluding this trigger that if anything is committed to my asset bundle repo, exclude that trigger. Do not trigger this pipeline when anything is committed to my asset bundle repo. Only trigger this pipeline when anything is committed to this repo, which is associated to my Databricks workspace. Then we define a pool. There are pools and agents in Azure DevOps, and pool is basically a set of VMs that will be using to run the jobs. So I'm telling to use a Azure VM. This is an Azure VM which is provided free of charge with some limits are there, and you can create your own self-hosted agents as well that can be attached to your own self-hosted pool. So depending on how your network is set up, like if your Databricks workspace is behind a network, you will have to create a self-hosted agent pool in order to deploy to that Databricks workspace. But my Databricks workspace is currently not behind a virtual private network. I don't need to use that. Then we have got in the YAML pipeline, we have got stages, jobs, and steps. You can have multiple stages in the pipeline. And one stage could be deployed to dev, another stage could be deployed to testing environment, another stage could be running your unit test cases, another stage could be deploying to production. So you can have multiple stages within the single YAML pipeline. For this purposes, I have only one stage, which is dev deployment, or you can call it a demo deployment. Within the stage, I can have multiple jobs, and these jobs are actually what run on individual agents. And then then there are steps within the jobs. And these steps are the lowest level within the YAML pipeline. I'm giving it a script. This is my REST API. So in Databricks, I have this link provided in the presentation towards the end. You can refer to the Databricks API. And in this case, I am updating the repo. So my API request is a patch kind of a request to update the repo. So over here, I'm doing this curl. I'm providing the personal access token. So I provided that in the variables as a hidden variable. This is a secret. Once you generate your personal access token and put it in the variable, if you modify it, you cannot read it. So you want to make sure that you have saved it if you want to reuse it. Then I'm passing my Databricks workspace URL, and then I'm passing the repo ID. So the repo ID is available when you click on the repo and go to settings. Repo ID is available over here. So you have to fetch the repo ID from here. And the repo ID has to be fetched for the folder where you're deploying it to. So this is the repo ID that I'm passing in my pipeline over here. And that is how the code deployment works. And that we already talked about. Let's talk about the workflow deployment and how I'm using the Databricks asset bundles. So I'm doing all the same things here. Now you see the trigger is missing over here, and I'm not doing a manual, I'm not doing any trigger over here because I'm excluding all the branches. Let me run the pipeline and then I'll come and explain it. But before I run the pipeline, I want to show that in the workflows, there is no workflow over here. When I run this pipeline, a workflow will be created in my Databricks workspace. And while the pipeline is running, let me explain how I'm using Databricks Asset Bundle within this pipeline. So all the initial steps are the same. In the workflow deployment section, the first step that we talked about was installing Databricks CLI. So here I'm installing the Databricks CLI. And now this is a Linux VM. The pool over here that I'm using is an Ubuntu latest machine, which is a Linux VM. So I'm not using winget that I showed in the presentation. I'm using a different URL over here to install Databricks CLI. Once Databricks CLI is installed, I am providing, like with the tilde sign, the config file. And again, the variables are being picked up from here, the pad token and the Databricks host workspace URL that is also being picked up from the variables. And this file gets saved to the user location on this VM, on this Ubuntu VM. So, which is why it was important to note like where to save this file once it is created. Sorry, one second. The next step here is initializing the bundle. So when I'm initializing this bundle is now not a new initialization. This bundle is actually what I have provided in my repo because that is where it is picking the resources from. So this bundle is then copied over to the build.sources directory folder, which is actually this folder behind the scenes on the Linux machine. And then I'm saying -t demo, which is my target environment. I'll show that in a minute. And then I'm validating the bundle and deploying the bundle. So the pipeline has completed because I got an email notification. And this pipeline, it got completed. You can see I've validated and deployed the bundle. And once that happens, the workflow gets deployed to the Databricks workspace. Now let me go back to the bundle again. So this is the template that we created. So in this template, we are including a resources folder where we have this test CICD workflow deploy pipeline. This is the pipeline that got deployed in my Databricks workspace over here because I provided the YAML pipeline for deployment purposes. And then I specified the target. So you can add a number of targets for your workspaces. Like if you have got your development workspace, production workspace, a testing workspace, those needed to be added as a target. And that is what I was using in my workflow deployment. I was using demo as a target. This -t stands for target, and that the demo is what I was using as my bundle target over here. So it knows, that is how it knows where to deploy the bundle to. So it packages this entire bundle. All of these files from here are copied to this location on this VM behind the scenes. This is the schema JSON file that I mentioned earlier, and this project name has to be the same with this folder name, which is actually your template file. And this is how it generates a configuration for the template file. So all these are necessary steps that you need to make, and this is as simple as that. And this is how we deploy. That was the demo. I'd like to thank Matt Gordon for introducing me to new stars of data, Andy for all his mentorship, Deborah for spending time with me for reviewing my presentation, and the Centric team without which this wouldn't be possible. These are the references that I was talking about throughout my presentation. I've got some Git references, CICD references, for learning the YAML files, Azure DevOps YAML pipeline references by Nathan Nellens. It's a very good reference. Number 5, the Databricks asset bundles, point number 5 over here, you can refer to that. For on-prem Git providers, point number 6 is what you can refer to. And for the Databricks REST API reference, point number 8 over here. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Any questions?